dollars over the next 10 years into resilient and sustainable food security, including 30 new faculty hires across the university. The OARDC Multidisciplinary Research Award, the OARDC Distinguished Faculty Research Award, and the ESA Award for Excellence in Integrated Pest Management. He has served on many federal grant review panels, the Ohio Food Policy Advisory Council, several boards of trustees, and the executive committee for the Kellogg Endowed Interinstitutional Network for Food and Agricultural Sustainability. His current work provides interdisciplinary leadership towards advancements in agroecosystem health and sustainable communities. So please help me welcome Dr. Casey Wilson.
Thank you. Is this thing working? Is there sound coming out? Of course not. I suppose that should turn green if it's actually working.
You have to hold it down.
Think it's working? If I turn this, it comes up. Yeah, it's working. Thank you very much. All right. Does that sound good for the people that are recording? That's a yes, or that's turn it up? Okay. Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Kendall for putting the students on my trail. And thanks especially to Teresa for all the work that she's done in setting this up. It's been a great day of reconnecting with old friends and making new ones, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. I'll tell you a little bit about the kind of work that I do in each of these areas. The Initiative for Food and Agricultural with a capital C, Transformation, Agroecosystems Management Program, and the Department of Entomology, and I'll kind of go in reverse order because that's more like the direction that my career has taken. So I'll start with the gross bug pictures. This is dead Galeria, melanella larvae. Those are pathogenic nematodes that are kind of boiling out of it. So I don't know if you're familiar with pathogenic nematodes, but they infect an insect, barf up some bacteria that release a toxin that kills the insect, and the insect becomes bacterial soup, and then the nematodes feed and reproduce on that bacterial soup and then come boiling out looking for another insect. So they're potential biological control agents. And I'll tell you a little bit about this one because it's probably the closest connection that I have with the agronomy department. So we did a survey several years ago of habitats that were around a vegetable production area for naturally occurring populations of these pathogenic nematodes, Herodotus bacteriophora in particular. And we found them in all of the habitats around this production area except where we wanted them, in the vegetable crops where they could be doing some good. So the question became, what are they doing out in these other habitats, and why are they not in vegetables? Long story short, we did a lot of sampling and compared the presence and absence of these nematodes and other free-living nematode species in each of these habitats. Using canonical correspondence analysis, we could show that the pathogenic nematodes occupied this really pretty unique set of conditions in the soils in these production areas that were consistent with what we saw in some of the grassy areas. So on this axis, let's see, I guess, yeah, so these two axes are basically the biotic conditions, and this kind of diagonal is more the physical conditions in the soil, and it was the combination of the two, the physical and the biological conditions. This is that is an enrichment index, go in this direction, and that's a structure index. So highly enriched and slightly kind of moderately structured soils is where we are finding these things, leading to an interesting hypothesis that this may be kind of an evolutionary trajectory of bacterial feeding nematodes that are associated with detritus, and that was borne out by using principal response curves to show that there was a significant correlation between the sites that were positive for nematodes and a set of insect species that are typical of detritus and detritivores. And these insects, or the pathogenic nematodes, are known to be phoretic on insects, so they'll catch a ride on insects to get from one site to the next. So the idea was there may be a trajectory going on here where they're using insects to get from one bacterial bloom to the next, and then it's kind of a short step to actually infecting the insect and creating the next bacterial bloom. So that's something that folks that work on these things typically are still working on. Spent a lot more of the career working on insect pests of vegetables. This is a diamondback moth, that's the pupa, and it's in a broccoli floret, and that's a big problem in broccoli because it becomes a contamination issue. Spent quite a few years working with colleagues down in Mexico, in the Bajío region of central Mexico on diamondback moth. They were putting out pheromone traps and collecting the diamondback moths every week, 3 times a week, for 17 years continuously. In entomology, we don't often get these kind of long-term, really detailed data sets. And by analyzing this time series, we were able to show that, yeah, the populations are increasing, especially over that middle period, and then they did decrease again in that third period. But also the pattern of fluctuations changed between the first period and actually the second too. So using the time series parameters, you can show this third period, this pattern of how increases follow decreases is actually the same as that second period, and it's much more wild fluctuations. And the two things that we could relate that to, looking at all of the other things that were going on in this agricultural ecosystem, were a change in the pattern of rainfall, and particularly when spring rains came, which were very important in depressing populations of diamondback moth, and also just the amount of broccoli that these guys were producing. So it went from very, very little in 1980 to about 40,000 hectares in the late 90s. And what you're doing is greatly increasing the carrying capacity of this ecosystem by lots of this one crop and causing pest populations like this. They were able to figure out pest management approaches that would help manage the problem in the processing plants. So even when those populations were getting very large, they were able to keep broccoli for processing going, but they were growing it mainly for processing, for freezing, and they had the hand labor, irrigation water, and things like that. And what started to happen out here after about 2000 also was losing the soil water. So there were places where you could drive through the Bajío and the ground just dropped because they were taking the soil water out. Salination of soils. They started having more problem with getting the labor that they needed to process broccoli. And then also because of changing markets, they shifted from a situation where you had all processors who were purchasing the broccoli to a combination of processors and fresh market. And in the fresh market, there's a whole different set of considerations for pest management. So the over-reliance on broccoli in this system was leading to all kinds of issues beyond, all kinds of problems beyond just diamondback moth. And that's something that we're all challenged with in working on agriculture. Anytime you plant a crop, you're going to come up with problems. This is the one that we've been working on in the United States since about the 1930s. And you notice who brings you this deal. He who has bread has many problems. He who has no bread has only one problem. This attitude was largely shaped back in the 70s. Earl Butts and folks like that are people who had been through the Great Depression when we had hunger in the United States at very large scales. And they were saying, you know, never again. And you can have a fair amount of sympathy for that. And we have produced a lot. We'll come back to that later. But we've certainly traded that one problem of producing a lot for a lot of other problems. So one of them is that we put farmers in a very tight squeeze. So just to simplify things, the amount that all of us spend on food that stays inside the farm gates keeps getting steadily smaller. And the amount that is spent on the cost of inputs that makes the few farmers remaining is able to produce as much as they do, as well as the value added beyond the gate keeps taking more and more of that share. So farmers are operating in this economic squeeze, which pushes them into this expand and get very efficient and specialized kind of mode. And you need to deal with that economic squeeze somehow. So it's either get good at operating in this ever tightening noose or tightening vise, or adopt a strategy that recovers back some of the cost of these inputs and some of the value added beyond the farm gate. Either way, it's not particularly easy to make a living as a farmer these days. And going from one problem to the next all the time, after a while starts to feel like this. A game of whack-a-mole where you solve one and in the process you create 3 more, which is great for job security, but really not what we're trying to do. And in entomology, there are examples where we've managed to do this. So starting quite a while ago, actually, there were a group of us that were willing to step back and look at agriculture as a system and think about what can you change about the system so that you have a different set of problems emerging. You're always going to have some problems emerging when you plant a crop, but a different set of problems that are easier to manage and discover some balance back into agriculture. And that became the Agroecosystems Management Program. This was a group, very interdisciplinary group that came together to think this way back in the early 90s. And one of the things that we did fairly early on is we pull people from outside of the university into the table whenever we were having conversations, because you get a group of academics together to talk about agriculture as a system and it can get kind of ethereal. So if you get people from outside of the university at the table, it can help keep it real. And one of the things they asked us to do is, you're talking about something that's so complex and multidimensional. Can you give us a way of understanding how we're doing as an agroecosystem? It has all these different dimensions, social and economic and environmental. How can we kind of get our arms around it and understand how we're doing? So one of the early projects that we had was setting out to establish or develop an index of agroecosystem health that you could use to do what these folks were asking for, give an idea of how they're doing in a particular place and maybe even map it out. If you're going to do that, you need the properties that define health, and we chose these, which were proposed by Gordon Conway quite a long time ago, actually, and still use these, although I'll tell you a little bit more about stability in a little bit. You can look at those properties and realize that they're not the kind of things that all operate in lockstep. There's trade-offs amongst these things. So this is kind of a multi-criterion issue. We hypothesized a set of key variables that would speak to those properties. And so this was kind of a minimal set. And then we set out to develop an index around these properties. And the idea behind the index was that you have variation on a landscape. And it's the variation that causes things to flow. And there's all kinds of stuff flowing. It can be goodwill or ill will among neighbors. It could be money flowing from a town to a farm. It could be pests flowing, or it could be beneficial organisms, or things that really are neither beneficial nor harmful. They're just flowing. But it's the pattern of variation in the landscape that results in the sources and sinks that cause things to flow. So long story short is we combine those key variables into an index using analytical hierarchy process, which has been called the multi-criterion decision model equivalent of combining apples and oranges. You could then map out the index. So green is higher values of agroecosystem health relative to what's in this example landscape that we worked on. Red is lower values, but all relative to what's in that particular area, which was about 8 miles wide and 3 miles north-south near where I am in Worcester, Ohio, at the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center. You can also drill down into this index and look at areas that are red. What is it that would make them green the most quickly? So what are the things that you could change to improve the health of that ecosystem? So again, as kind of a decision-making tool to help people. And healthy agroecosystems are important now. They're going to become even more important. So these are the predictions for climate change for our part of the country. You're on this map as well, but from where I'm from is like right in here, where it's both darker blue and darker brown. Darker blue means more heavy rainfall events. Darker brown means more consecutive dry days. So wetter when it's wet, drier when it's dry, and at least Over here, there's not a whole lot of good predictions on how that pattern is going to go back and forth from wet to dry. So until you really know what the pattern of rainfall, in addition to rising temperatures, is, to me, the element that best describes climate change is this element that's in this row that starts with the element of surprise, and probably a little too much of it. So that's one of the reasons that we need to get serious about resilience in agricultural systems. So I don't know how many of you have seen this diagram. This is in a book called Panarchy by Buzz Holling. And it describes a series of changes that systems in general go through. They could be ecosystems, they could be social systems. The idea is that, a lot of the time they're kind of bouncing back and forth between exploitation and conservation. If you think about what we do in sustainable agriculture, it's a lot of times every time we plow a field, we push it back so that we can exploit it, and we try to get systems to act more like these conserved systems, so there aren't these wild pest outbreaks. We still get what we need from them, but things are operating fairly stably, which is all fine until every now and then the environment changes to the point where this no longer works, and then there's a release and a chance for all this stuff that was conserved up here to reorganize, with the possibility of losing capacity when that happens, and then you're back into this back and forth between exploitation and conservation. So if you look at the predictions coming along from climate change, and Fred Kirschenman challenged this with us a long time ago. He said, if you're going to talk about sustainable agriculture, tell me how you're going to farm under these conditions. That's the kind of things that will force rethinking of everything we're doing, and release of the kind of things that we have wrapped up in agriculture right now. And resilience is about the capacity of the system to deal with that kind of change. So there's one piece of it that's about stability, which is you can take a shock and still come back to where the system was. But even more important in resilience is if you get these kind of huge changes, how well can the system adapt? And this is what the Resilience Alliance would call navigating the back loop. So the release and reorganization and regaining the functions that are important, like people have enough food to eat and the system is operating on a sustainable basis. And if you look at the kind of things that make a system more resilient, it's the ability to self-organize, capacity for learning and adaptation, and again, this ability to rebuild when necessary. If you think about what it takes in agriculture to accomplish those things, well, it's diversity that gives you the ability to adapt. So there's diversity within crops, so that's potato, and the Incas had a system that used individual, very small farmers to continue adapting potato to very local conditions. And you wind up with a lot of variation in the kind of potato varieties down in South America still. There's variation in what you eat, what you produce and eat. And if you go to markets in other parts of the world, you'll see all kinds of things that you will not find in the grocery store here. We've got like 35 different things that we eat in fruits and vegetables in the United States. This might be growing a little bit as some tropical fruits start making it onto shelves, but for the most part, it's the same stuff anywhere you go. You go anywhere else and it's more like 200 different things that are seasonal and quite varied. And then there's variation in the people that are doing the producing. And there are a lot of people that could be producing in the U.S. that add additional diversity to an agricultural ecosystem. So if you match up those kind of characteristics, particularly the self-organization and innovation as a backdrop for these kinds of things that were important in our model of agroecosystem health, that's where agroecosystem health and resilience come together. So if you have each of those kind of areas, then you'll have both a healthy agroecosystem and a more resilient agroecosystem. So that kind of conceptual thinking is what's behind a lot of the work that we do in the agroecosystems management program. And I'll give you a few examples of that. This is a small and medium-sized farm grant that we have right now where we're looking at the very early stages of diversification of a relatively small farm. So the average farm size in Ohio is about 180 acres, which is not nearly enough land to make a living growing corn and soybeans, but yet a lot of them are in corn and soybeans. So if you're going to farm at that scale, what are the kinds of things that you would do that would give you a different economy than an economy of scale? Because you don't have the scale for that. And so the economists call this economy of scope. So in the diversification and managing that diversity, you reduce input costs, gain new markets, and there are economies that economists are actually starting to talk about and study but as part of this. So we have economists as part of this project doing off-farm work on market entry thresholds and what does that do for new enterprise opportunities. And then on the farm, we're looking at how quickly do soils change, how quickly do you start gaining some of the benefits of the diversity and the way you're using the diversity on the farm. We're on that same farm, which has been donated to OARDC, we're monitoring diversity using sound and soundscape. And this is something that I learned today, Lisa Schultz-Moore in the STRIPS project is also using, but in a slightly different way. We're interested in the entire biophonic soundscape and how is that changing over time. So we're taking recordings every 30 seconds, every half hour, all day, every day, and we'll continue to do that in the future to build that kind of time series. The kind of recordings that are sonograms that you get look like this. So this is a recorder that's out by the woods. You can see these are rain and storm events, these big spikes. But sometime in the spring, you get the spring peepers. That's the insects in late summer and then trailing off. So you can see the biophonic sound signature, and the question is, how complete and how diverse it is. This is a set of recordings that were up by the farmstead. So there's a whole lot more human activity going on around here, but you can still see those same signatures. And the question is not, we know that people are supposed to be part of agriculture. They're supposed to be machines and those kinds of noises. So what's the interplay? And how complete is the biological soundscape? And is it changing as we change the practices that are in place on that farm? Working on increasing the diversity of people coming into agriculture. We have a grant with through the Higher Education Challenge program with USDA, where we're establishing a statewide network of sustainable agriculture education programs. So our partners in that are Central State University, which is our newest 1890 land grant. It only took them until 2016 to be designated as an 1890 land grant, but that was a couple of our Congress people, Marcia Fudge in particular, who's on the Ag Committee, that helped get that established. So they've launched a sustainable agriculture degree. We're about to launch one at Ohio State, and there's certificate and associate degree programs at Lorain County Community College. So it's reaching out to a much broader audience than we've been able to in the past to attract students into degrees in agriculture. Another way we've done it is similar to a lot of the work that takes on here, Practical Farmers of Iowa in particular, and a lot of the work that you folks do, and University of Minnesota colleagues and the like, is create supply chains that create a draw. So this is a website that we developed to help entrepreneurs on supply chains connected with agriculture get together at the planning stage and start planning entire supply chains instead of launching a business that's part of a non-existent change and then hope everybody else shows up. So there's an opportunity for them to find each other using the tools that are on this website, which essentially you identify what are the inputs and outputs from each business case, and wherever there's a match, it makes a connection, and then people can get in touch with each other and start planning in cahoots. So one example that was starting to develop on this was from Northeast Ohio. This is a very large dairy farm. This is not the swimming pool. And the farmer needed a way to deal with that stuff to get his permit. So what he proposed was a biodigester. And we have a company that is on our campus at OARDC that is working on producing a U.S. industry to create biodigesters So that's great. Now, but the farmer, the dairy farmer himself, was not all that interested in the products that come out of the biodigester, the methane and heat, because he's got cows. He's got plenty of methane and heat. He just wants to get rid of the manure, but there's a smaller grower down the road who already had a contract with the Elyria City Schools for more fresh produce during the winter, so he wanted to site a greenhouse by the biodigester, use the heat and methane in the greenhouse, produce more fresh vegetables for the school, and then the school had volunteered to collect the food waste and send it back to the biodigester. So that's a good example of that kind of industrial ecology where one business's waste becomes the next business's inputs. So truth in advertising, this never happened. It all broke down in the negotiations between the biodigester company and the dairy farmer on who gets how much of the money and access to the biodigester, but it's a great idea. So if any of you can put this in place, go for it. And that's really very similar to the kind of flows that we were talking about when we were talking about this index of agroecosystem health, flows of food and energy from farms to nearby communities, and support for the farm coming from the community, greater cycling of materials on the farm that was behind that index of agroecosystem health. So that's some insight into some of the ways that we're trying to help develop greater diversity in Ohio agriculture, and to really understand what we have in Ohio agriculture now and why it is the way it is. You kind of have to go back a few years, like about 1.8 million years, to the Pleistocene, which was when Ohio was heavily glaciated. So the gray areas where the glaciers hit, you can kind of see the line between the glaciers. And what they did in Ohio was to bulldoze these very deep river valleys. So they used to, the paleogeologists tell us there was a river called the Taze River system that came up from the southern Appalachians and arced through Ohio and then down what's now the Mississippi, and the Continental Divide was somewhere in here between that and what became the St. Lawrence. And the glaciers bulldozed very rich glacial till into those deep valleys and kind of changed the drainage, so the Continental Divide is now somewhere up here, pretty close to Lake Erie, and you have the Ohio River and the St. Lawrence, of course. So just keep your eye on that dividing line between the glaciers and the unglaciated part of Ohio, which is obviously much more hilly. So that's the glaciation. That's median household income in 1999. And so we could also update that and make it 2016, and it would look very much the same. So I know this is going to be shocking to a group like this, but there are people out there that don't recognize that our wealth actually does come from our soils. This kind of helps make that point. I'll do that one more time. So again, very rich soils that were deposited by those glaciers, leading to a very ecologically rich state. I mean, we straddle 4 major ecological zones. This is the Gordon Vegetation Index, and I don't expect you to be able to read the legend there, but the point is there's a lot of very varied and rich plant communities. You can kind of still see the line of glaciation and how it affects the plant communities, but there's quite a bit of variation. You can grow a lot of different kinds of things in Ohio. So fast forward to about 200 years ago, and that's what European settlers find when they come to Ohio. So this is part of the state. They weren't necessarily the best naturalists all the time, so there were some that thought that this prairie land out in the west part of the state was kind of useless because you couldn't even grow trees there. But they pretty quickly figured out that you could grow corn really well in these river valleys. So this is the Scioto River. Figured out you could grow corn there very quickly. So it's now 1815, you're on the Ohio frontier and you got a lot of corn. What are you going to do with that? What do you do with corn? Feed it to pigs, all right. Liz will spend time in Ohio. Yeah, exactly, you can give it legs. Well, pigs, or there was a guy named William Renwick who in 1813 figured out that you could do corn-finished beef in Ohio, march the beef over the mountains, and sell them on the international market out of Baltimore. So you give the corn legs. You don't have corn dryers, so it's not like you can just ship it somewhere. And it's outside of a couple military garrisons on the Ohio River, there's nobody to sell it to there in Ohio. So what else can you do with corn? There you go. Usually the students come up with that one immediately. So you can turn it into alcohol, and the Ohio frontier was just dotted with these stills. And it wasn't because it was perpetual spring break on the Ohio frontier, it's because that's something you could do with corn and turn it into something you could actually sell. So they would take the corn, distill it into whiskey, put the whiskey in barrels and put them on flatboats and send those down to the river to New Orleans and sell it on the international market. And then this is where we come back to the pigs. So Cincinnati was the center of the meat packing industry before it moved to railroads in Chicago. And it was called Porkopolis because you had 2 distilleries and 9 or so breweries, I think it was, and all of them producing a lot of distillers' grains. So all of them surrounded with hog operations, and you had pigs running wild everywhere because you could raise pigs and chop them up and add salt and put those in barrels and put them on the flatboats with the whiskey and send it on down to New Orleans and sell it on the international market. So I love this last quote. Perfecting the system that packs 15 bushels of corn into a pig, packs the pig into a barrel, and sends them over the mountains and over the ocean to feed mankind. That was 1820. So fast forward now to 28. Oh, first, that's a flying pig statue, which are all over Cincinnati. This is the first Lord Brabazon of Tara, who in 1909 strapped a basket onto the wing of his biplane and put a pig in the basket and then took off into the air to prove once and for all that pigs are able to fly. The bystanders said the pig didn't seem to have a lot to do with it, but the pig did fly, so there you go. So that's Ohio now. This is the 2007 mass crop data layer. We could look at 2017 and it would look exactly the same. So remember that Gordon Vegetation Index. There's all kinds of diversity in the state. We can grow everything that's on this big index, and we do, but you see 5 things from space. That's all corn and beans on the upper left. It's all grass and trees on the lower right. And what's changed since 1815 is there are now a lot of gray spots. So there actually are some people around that you could sell stuff to in Ohio. So those are our cities. Columbus, Cincinnati, Dayton, Cleveland, Akron, Canton, Youngstown, Toledo, and then smaller cities dotted in there, and almost in kind of a uniform distribution of cities, all ringed with rural land. So Doug O'Brien, who was Kathleen Merrigan's assistant at USDA, used to say, if you can't do local food systems in Ohio, where are you going to do it? And yet, nobody eats the corn and soybeans that are getting grown over there. That's all feed kinds of corn and soybeans. So what's changed since 1815? Well, let's see. We grow a lot of corn. We brew it into alcohol. We feed animals, and we sell it on the international market. And what we've managed to add is soybeans, which is not an enormous shift. I mean, you could still see the Scioto River Valley right there, and it's all still growing corn. So I think we probably could think about being able to do something more than this at this point with today's technology. The farmers that grow the corn and soybeans, though, are very proud of what they do. They feel very strongly that they feed the world. And unfortunately, the data is not real good for supporting that contention. So for one thing, about 1 in 9 people in the world are chronically malnourished. Those are FAO statistics. And it's not because they're not producing enough corn and soybeans. So the FAO statistics also show it's about 2,940 kilocalories per person per day that we were producing in 2015. So it takes about 2,000 kilocalories per person per day for women and about 2,500 kilocalories per person per day for men to maintain body weight and keep from being malnourished or not have enough calories, at least. Those are rough figures, but you can do a little quick back of the envelope map and figure out this is enough to feed 9 billion people, which is the number that we're really worried about being able to feed in 2050. And we already have enough to meet the caloric requirements of 9 billion people, and yet 1 in 9 people are chronically malnourished. There's also some inconvenient things like less than 1% of our exports go to where it's really needed to feed the world. It goes to countries that have money, not the places where people really need food. And also, most of the world's food supply, most of what people are eating are not coming from corn and soybean operations in Ohio. They're coming from small family farms. So the data doesn't quite match up globally, and that 1 in 9 people chronically malnourished, it's not that different from what we've got in Ohio. So this is Economic Research Service data from 2014 to 16. Darker red means higher percentage of households experiencing low food security. Low food security is basically all the stress of not quite knowing where your next meal is coming from and already cutting corners on diet so that you have a suboptimal and less healthy diet. Very low food security is where you've got outright hunger on a regular basis. So it's about 1 in 6 or 7 households that are experiencing low food security, 1 in 13 or 14 that are experiencing very low food security. That's not that different from the 1 in 9 hunger on a regular basis. And these rates go way up for basically the categories that you'd kind of expect. I mean, unfortunately, it goes up for households with children, which is not good at all, and also single mothers, African American, Hispanic households. So it's very inequitable as well. It's not just everywhere else in Ohio, so we can talk about this on the Ohio State campus. It's on our own campus. This was a study done a few years ago. We found about 15.2% of the respondents to this survey, Ohio State students, experiencing very low food security, which means they're going hungry on a regular basis. And the rates are higher again for African American, first generation, non-traditional Asian, especially students who are off campus. So Dr. Lamke and I were on a APLU commission that wrote a report recently that started out with the title of The Challenge of Change, Engaging Public Universities to Feed the World. And we could point to these statistics and say, we're not even feeding our own students. Come on, this is not the way to title this thing and not the way to think about it. So we did manage to get it changed. And I encourage you to take a look at the commission report. We managed to get the title changed to Harnessing University Discovery, Engagement, and Learning to Achieve Food and Nutrition Security. And in that, we do, I think, a fairly credible job of breaking it down into what do you have to change about this entire system to really create food security. There's a group of us in the Interinstitutional Network for Food, Agriculture, and Sustainability that also wrote an essay on taking that even one step further, because we looked at this and figured, okay, there are parts of these recommendations that we could use to really go after some of the really serious issues in our food system, like it's very inequitable, and address things like structural racism. And there were some gaps that in the essay we fill in. So I encourage you to take a look at both of those, the APLU Commission report as well as this additional essay that takes it a step further. So I mentioned we took a pretty systemic view of how do we address food security. Our food chain is fairly long and has a lot of steps in it. So there's the production part, yes, but that's not all there is to it. It takes more than just producing more to get the food to where people are, because there's these steps of access and then using the food. You notice there's waste on the end. It'd be very nice if we could connect that back to the land and create a closed loop out of this thing, but that's not quite happening. So there are those that say, you know, well, if there's a blockage somewhere up here in access and utilization, it still means we just have to produce more, because there's not as much getting out of that blockage. So if we produce more and jam more in the front end, then a little more will get out at the bottom. So if that's the way you're approaching a blockage in a pipe. I don't want to be around when your toilet's clogged. And that's the kind of thing that we have to address all of the steps in this change, and I think we do that in the report. And that kind of systems approach is what was behind a proposal that became the Initiative for Food and Agricultural, with a capital C, transformation. This is a new initiative at Ohio State. It's one of our Discovery Themes initiatives. It was created with a very bottom-up process, which I give our administration a lot of credit for. They asked us, the faculty, for our ideas about how to address these big challenges, including food security, and then supported some of those proposals, and this was one of them. Work as the Kellogg chair gave me a lot of freedom to build relationships with people across the university, so when this opportunity came up, we already had a pretty diverse group of scholars who were willing to come to the table and propose a very comprehensive approach. So it starts with hiring 30 new faculty, as Teresa mentioned. These are the areas in which we're hiring, and it kind of gives you an idea of how we are covering those areas of availability and access and utilization, and how it wraps back around to health. There's also this culture, art, and design as a backdrop for this entire thing, because it essentially is a cultural issue that we have rates of food insecurity like the ones we showed in Ohio, and most people who are food secure just don't even know that. That's a cultural issue, and kind of hearts and mind. One of the things that to me is so different about what we're able to do in this project is that we're actually getting together as faculty across the university to talk about who we should hire and why, and what kind of work would really enhance what we're all doing at Ohio State. So here's a picture of the last time we did that at Ohio State University. I think I'm behind the tree in this picture, but this is actually a famous photo from, you know, the stereoscope things where you have photos on both sides and you look through and it becomes 3D. This was one of the very first ones, and it actually is on the Ohio State campus, and probably was the last time we had one of these conversations about who to hire and why as a group. What we challenged the faculty teams that come up with each of these 30 position descriptions to do is identify what's the network that you expect for somebody in this position. Who are they going to work with? In what colleges? What interdisciplinary programs? Who are their partners outside the university? So we had this actual a priori network map for once we hire all 30 of these people. So the new hires are in here, and all these lines represent the a priori connections that we were expecting. And of course they come in and they may form those connections, and they may come up with some of their own. And in that previous slide, the Buckeyes, of course, represented the new faculty. They actually have faces. These are the people that we're already starting to hire. And you can see it's a really exciting time, because these are great people, and they're very diverse academically and in basically all other ways, including how they approach things. All of these position descriptions are kind of unique positions that state that you need an interdisciplinary dimension to the work that you're doing. And each of these faculty members comes in really excited about that. And it's led to a kind of a different and more diverse group of people applying for the positions in the first place, and then coming in really excited about doing the work and doing the work together. You notice all these bubbles are touching because they're not completely separate areas. They're areas that do overlap. And also, just to make it very clear, these are our new hires. There's another 150 existing faculty that were already at Ohio State around these folks that are now connecting. So the work that I'm really getting into now are that, oh, that's right, there's a face on the Buckeye too. I don't know if you recognize that nut, but it does have a face as well. You may have seen it at a football game or someplace. Anyway, so this is the handbook that's on my desk, because the next step really is weaving the networks amongst the faculty that we're bringing in. This is a view of just the food policy network in Ohio. So that's one of the kind of 5 major areas. Some of those dots are Ohio State folks, but most of them are not. And the lines, of course, are the connections between them in this very large network. So it's very much an intentional gathering of faculty with diverse expertise and then using that to influence and support the work of this network that extends way outside of the university. Another network that we're building is through a project that the Kellogg Foundation has funded to a group called Solutions from the Land, and we're advisors on the project, but it's essentially pulling the entire farm community in Ohio together to come up with their plan for how they address things like that 1 in 6 households experiencing low food security, even though they feed the world, and the kinds of environmental issues that we're experiencing that probably do have something to do with farming, like toxic algal blooms in Lake Erie and things like that. And farmers often feel like nobody listens to them, so this is giving them the chance to kind of develop their approach and their solution, and then let's work on it together. Our theory of change is that the solutions really are out there in the community, and what we can do is insert some systems thinking, some particular kinds of knowledge that we can create in the university, but there's plenty of it that's already out there in the community. So it's really where all that comes together that the culture change takes place, and the change in things like food security. So just one example project that we have going is a project that's funded by the Kellogg Foundation again, and this is to Ohio State. But we're calling it Buckeye ISA, which is a flip on CSA. So CSA is one farm and lots of customers. This is one big customer, Ohio State University, and lots of small producers that can aggregate and sell to Ohio State University. Ohio State has a goal of 40% of the food served on campus, and this is across student dining, the hospitals, athletics, the works, coming from local and sustainable sources by 2025. I'm on the panel along with Brian Snyder, our executive director, to figure out what the action plan is to put that into place. And what we came up with, and we're working on those definitions of local and sustainable, but the idea behind this one was that's Ohio State pointing a lot of economic opportunity at more local sources. So let's point that opportunity in neighborhoods where there's really a need for opportunity and folks that have been kind of shut out of opportunity in the past. So the idea is a whole network of participants in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. These are some of the scenes from the first year of the project, which is basically this summer. So we have extension involved with doing some training for folks that need training in production that have never tried this before. There's a business team that consists of people in the community working on the kind of aggregation and logistics part of it, business plans for the individual producers, as well as the network as a whole. There's a policy dimension to this in that this project is addressing something like 9 points that are part of the Columbus Local Food Action Plan, which was put together by the City of Columbus and the county, Franklin County. So there's a keen interest from both city and county governments in this project and how it contributes to their set of policy recommendations. We're doing biometric screening on the families that are involved to make sure that this actually is supporting the health of kids, because that, in the end of the day, is what it's really about, is helping to improve the health of these guys. So the idea is that people are both producing and selling to Ohio State, so there's enough economic return coming in to make it worth doing it, as well as the diet in the home is increasing because they're producing fresh food there. So one example project. Another one that gets back more to the kind of things that we're used to with science and research is a project with collaboration with UC Davis and the Agricultural Sustainability Institute there, where we have a NSF research coordinating network to piece together all of the data that has to do with everything from before production to the health outcomes after consumption. And if we really were able to assemble all of that data, which exists in lots of different places, lots of different sources, then could we use a big data approach to create smarter food sheds that have less of the access and utilization availability issues than we have right now. So again, take a fairly systematic and systems approach to where the data is, who might have it, and who might have use for it. So that's some examples of what we're doing with the Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation. We're kind of halfway through the hiring, so it's a work in progress. I'm just going to end with one quick shameless plug. We do have a graduate program in the environmental science graduate program in agroecosystem science. So if there are undergrads that are interested in graduate work in agroecosystem science, we do have a way of pursuing that. And one in your midst, Liz Colby, who is our student at Ohio State and has gone on to great things with Practical Farmers of Iowa, is one who followed that degree program. So you can talk to Liz if you have any questions about it. So thanks again, Teresa, Kendall. Thanks for coming, and happy to answer some questions and stick around and chat. And thanks again for a great visit.
Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed hearing about all the programs you have going on. One of the things that stood out to me was that map of the agroecosystem health, if I understood it correctly. So I guess, so I guess I had a few questions based on that map. You said that it's relative, that the health is relative to the size of the map. So there you said it was relatively small.
Let me see if I can get to the actual map. There we go.
Yep.
Okay.
So you said the scale is based on that map and the land used for that map.
The index itself.
Yeah.
So you notice this is varying from 0 to 1. So what you do is you take the data on those 6 key variables and collect data for all of this area, and it's a little bit technically challenging because the scales and kind of pixel size, I guess, for the data varies amongst those different kinds of data points. But you take all of those, they're all measured in different kinds of scales, so you normalize it all. So everything, all of the data is coming from within this area. You normalize it 0 to 1 and then combine it into an index that varies from 0 to 1. So 1 would be the highest index for agroecosystem health within this area. 0 would be or whatever the lowest value would be the lowest value within this area, but not compared to Thailand or the next county over.
Right. So then how big of an area would you look at then? Because that can change drastically. If you look at all of Ohio, that's going to change these specific pieces of land. So I guess it kind of leads into my second question. How do you utilize this?
Yeah.
So let's say you generate this map and you see a red area. Can you parse out what's lacking in that area?
Yes. And that's exactly how you use it. So in a red area, you can drill back down and look at what the underlying values of each of those key variables were. And then, you can do the what if kind of thing. So if I change biodiversity by X amount, how quickly does that change it? Or another thing that I didn't have time to go into, some of the areas that are red or especially pink are red or pink for a different reason. So what is it that's, holding the areas that are in red and pink back, and which of those variables would push them towards green the most quickly? And then the same with the areas that are more green, what is it that's improving the health in those areas? So, to your earlier point, if you expand it to all of Ohio, you would still see the same relative differences within this, but it may shrink the scale that's within this area, because now you have new areas that may be even healthier than any of the areas here, or areas that are, weaker than any of the areas here in terms of health. So to me, it's a tool, and my background is systems analysis and modeling. So if you're going to do that, you need to be able to describe the current state. And this is a state that's a state in terms of static variables that you can measure and map as a point in time. But think back to the properties that we're modeling. The idea is that this current state is related to properties that play out over time. So sustainability, you can't even think of that as a point in time. But you can think about a current state in a place that could lead to greater or less sustainability, depending on what that state looks like. So it's very much the way that you've combined the data into the index is based on the people that did it and their understanding of how that kind of state relates to properties that play out over time. Does that help with how you might use it? It's, what's challenging in terms of using it is getting your hands on the data. So this was a massive amount of work to get our hands on the data to just do this case study. And we've since done a couple of paper trials. There was a paper that I flashed up later that was in Journal of Environmental Science and Studies that looked at a slightly larger area and data that's a little easier to get your hands on. So it's a little coarser look at agroecosystem health, but you can get the data to do it over larger areas. And, that kind of stuff has never really held me back a whole lot because I figure, data is accumulating quickly and ways of collecting the kind of data that you would need to do this. So let's figure out how you would use it if you had it, and maybe that creates pull to actually collect the data. But yeah, thanks for the question. If I did answer it, in fact. Okay. Anything else I can?
So in that regards then, have you seen people starting to try and use this index, like targeting specific red areas and trying to make changes there and seeing if it can be cost effective? Yeah,
honestly, I have not at this point. I mean, I'd love to see that. And the other thing that we did not do is this index was created by a group of faculty, basically, and a few students. If you go to the people that live in that area and ask them to do the analytical hierarchy process, you might get a little bit different map. So there's really interesting information in that. I just haven't had a chance to do more of that. We did take this and also kind of use the same approach to create a community sustainability index with some colleagues in city and regional planning. So the same kind of approach, but looking at an urban area. And then, could you map out how things are? And in that case, we actually did go straight to the community to build the index. And that is one aspect of the analytical hierarchy process. I mean, it's been used quite a bit in multi-criteria decision-making, a lot of times in environmental questions, but that is one of the benefits is it's a consensus view of the group that you've asked to do the analytical hierarchy process.
Isn't it also possible that some of those red zones should never be made into agricultural systems to begin with? That you need land for other things as well?
They are part of the agricultural ecosystem, at least the way that we define it.
Oh, so they're not.
So this is all.
It's not a big parking lot where I see red somewhere there.
There are places. Well, okay, that a certain amount of that red is owned by the state. So the social organization score is really low because the state does not belong. So the social organization was measured in terms of, I think, 39 questions in a survey that had to do with membership in local organizations, connections with other farmers, and the state didn't rank all that high in that. The state doesn't belong to, the local Grange and the local church and, these kinds of things. So they wind up pretty low on the social score. They're still part of the ecosystem. They're not a place. Yeah, they're not a place where there's.
Not all land will be agriculture.
Or not all land will be commercial agriculture, because in a lot of those places they're research farms. But that's the profit side, CAUV values, things like that are very different on research land than in a commercial farm. So. Yeah, and with 6.
I'm saying just don't panic if you see a lot of
right.
red. You have to know what's really there.
Right, and drill down to why it's red. Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
If there's no other questions, I think we'll wrap up. Thanks again.
I'm going to take these things and